Next on Currents News, a Brooklyn priest is taking over a major Catholic organization, which is considered to be a lifeline for the poor and needy. This comes amid crisis throughout the world. I'm Tim Harfman, and I'll have more.
The Vatican is accusing ultra-conservative media groups for stolen statues being dumped in the Tiber River, calling it an act of hate and an attack on Indigenous people. The latest developments are ahead in an exclusive report from Rome. And according to a new study, none of the above is the fastest growing religious identifier in the United States, outpacing Catholics. We're breaking down those numbers. Plus, millions of Americans from coast to coast are facing warnings tonight about rough weather and dangerous fires. The news starts right now. Good evening, I'm Tamara Lane. The ceasefire in Syria is expiring and fighting could resume at any moment. With that as the backdrop, a Brooklyn priest is taking charge of one of the Pope's top agencies for humanitarian relief. New York Cardinal Timothy Dolan named the new leader today. Currents News' Tim Harfman has the story from Manhattan.
I'd like to introduce Monsignor Peter Vicari to you.
New York's Cardinal Timothy Dolan announcing a Brooklyn priest as head of the Catholic organization considered a lifeline for the poor.
Personally, it's a great challenge for me. It's a new challenge for me.
Monsignor Peter Vicari is the new president of the Catholic Near East Welfare Association, or Kanawa, one of the Vatican's top agencies for humanitarian relief. The organization helps churches across the Middle East, Northeast Africa, India, and Eastern Europe. Cardinal Dolan serves as chairman and treasurer of Kanawa.
You got to put Kanawa in that constellation of efforts of the church that remind us of the universality and of the sacred responsibility of, as St. Paul reminds us, of thinking with and for the church.
The new appointment comes at a turbulent time. The ceasefire in Syria is expiring, and fighting could resume at any moment. Monsignor Vicari says the crisis in the Middle East is a high priority.
This is a very, very painful time for Christians in the entire region, but since you bring out Syria, specifically in Syria, where we are really seeing martyrs for the faith.
Since the start of the Syrian refugee crisis, Kanawa has provided food and shelter, helped those who have been displaced, and built churches. And relief efforts won't slow down under Monsignor Vicari.
I really am considering Monsignor Kozar now to be my teacher in so many ways in the world of Kanawa.
The Brooklyn priest succeeds Monsignor John Kozar, Kanawa's president since 2011. Making sure that Catholicism stayed in the Middle East was one of the pillars of his career and ministry.
We always remained in support of the Eastern Catholic churches, never dictating, but accompanying, walking with.
And the organization remains dedicated to its mission as Monsignor Vicari begins his new assignment. In Manhattan, Tim Harfman, Currents News.
Russian and Turkish troops will now take joint control over a vast swath of formerly Kurdish-held territory in northern Syria. The two presidents met today to negotiate. Both Putin and Erdogan agreed to set up a so-called terror-free safe zone in northern Syria along the Turkish border now that the ceasefire is over. The region had been a home base to Kurdish militia, and Erdogan is threatening to open fire on any who don't leave. The ceasefire was brokered by the United States to give the Kurds a chance to evacuate. Today's meeting in Sochi illustrates the growing influence that Russia now has over Syria. Now for important news about faith. Around the U.S., there's a sharp increase in people saying they don't belong to any religion. Currents News' Emily Dribby reports on the new findings and how it's affecting the Diocese of Brooklyn.
The portion of Americans who don't pray, those with no religious affiliation, is rising. At this moment, there are more nuns, a nickname for religiously unaffiliated people, than Catholics in the country. New data from the Pew Research Center shows the number of Catholics slipping in the last decade, but the amount of nuns growing. Since 2009, nuns have boomed from 17% to 26%. The number, which is more pronounced among millennials, doesn't really shock the faithful here in one of the world's most secular cities.
I wasn't surprised, honestly, because I had seen that myself.
Lauren Gentry, a youth minister at a Queens parish, has seen the phenomena among her peers.
A lot of people have been catechized, meaning they know, certain aspects of the faith, but they haven't necessarily been evangelized. So they really don't know Christ.
But in the Brooklyn diocese, the trend hasn't been stifling the faithful. Instead, diocesan leaders like Paul Morisi, the director of youth and young adult formation, say it's been inspiring them to get creative.
I really looked at it and said, what a great opportunity doing outreach for youth and young adults in our church today. What we hear the Holy Father talking about is accompaniment. How are we journeying with young people, meeting them where they're at here, and then walking with them on this journey?
For example, we just started a new confirmation program where instead of sitting there with a textbook, they're in small groups, they're discussing, they're reflecting on different themes of the faith to really figure out, okay, what does this mean to me? Like, how does it apply to my life?
Meanwhile, the church can no longer claim a majority of the nation's Hispanic population either. In the past decade, the Pew data shows the amount of nuns in that group growing by 8%. But in the Brooklyn diocese, some parishes are bucking that trend.
I don't think that we are going with the trend, thank God. There is a lot of initiatives from Futures in Education, Bishop DiMarcio. We have this scholarship for youth ministers. Here in my parish, we have our youth group is like 70 kids.
Father Jorge Ortiz Garay's parish, St. Bridget, has a large and thriving Hispanic population. He credits diocesan initiatives aimed at evangelizing and a strong youth program. He says young people are some of his best preachers, and he remains optimistic. Also optimistic, Catholic numbers worldwide. Despite trends in the United States, the Vatican reports the population of Catholics is still growing, with 14 million Catholics joining the church across the globe since 2017. Emily Druby, Currents News.
A Texas Monsignor will not be indicted on charges he assaulted a married woman. Monsignor Frank Rossi had been accused of manipulating a Houston businesswoman into a sexual relationship while serving as her spiritual advisor. Now a grand jury is refusing to indict him. Monsignor Rossi had been the deputy to Houston's Cardinal Daniel DiNardo before going on temporary leave. There's no word tonight about the priest's future assignments. Tonight, the Vatican is strongly denying reports that the clerical sex abuse crisis is causing a cash crunch. A new book claims the church is at risk of default by 2023 because of declining donations. But the Pope's close advisor, Cardinal Oscar Maradiaga, is insisting that the report is false, saying it is an attempt to discredit the church. Now to the latest news on the impeachment battle. President Trump is calling it all a lynching. He fired off a tweet this morning accusing Democrats of ignoring fairness and his legal rights. He then wrote, all Republicans must remember what they are witnessing here, a lynching, before insisting he would ultimately win. That Trump tweet is sparking a lot of reactions from both sides of the aisle. Democrats are condemning his use of the word, while Republicans are generally supportive. Also today, the top U.S. diplomat in Ukraine, William Taylor, reportedly testified behind closed doors that there was a link between military aid and Ukraine investigating Trump's political rivals. These developments are all coming on the heels of the president's demand for more support from the GOP. John Lawrence has that part of the story.
President Trump taking aim at the House impeachment inquiry.
What happened to the whistleblower? They're gone because they've been discredited.
House Democrats are investigating allegations the president abused his power by pushing Ukraine to probe his political rivals.
What we need to do is build this case, solidify it. None of these witnesses have contradicted anything in the complaint.
President Trump wants Republicans to get tough during this impeachment battle, just like he says the Democrats are.
I think they're lousy politicians. But two things they have: they're vicious and they stick together.
House Democrats did stick together Monday, halting a GOP-led effort to bring a floor vote on a resolution to censure Representative Adam Schiff, among those leading the impeachment investigation. Supporters of the bill said Schiff is guilty of misleading conduct for exaggerating the phone call President Trump had with his Ukrainian counterpart. Schiff responded afterward, tweeting that Republicans lacked the courage to confront the most dangerous and unethical president in American history.
The House is going to impeach the president. They can't put it back in the tube now. And I think unless something else comes out that we don't know about, he's highly likely to be acquitted in the Senate.
I'm John Lawrence reporting.
Jimmy Carter is in the hospital tonight. America's oldest living former president breaking his pelvis after falling at home. This is the third time in recent months where the 95-year-old Carter has taken a spill. A spokesperson for the Carter family says the break is minor and Carter is in good spirits. Strong in his Christian faith, Jimmy and his wife, Rosalind, recently celebrated another milestone, becoming the longest married first couple with more than 7 decades together. Now to the latest on 2 political elections gripping the world. Justin Trudeau is going to stay as the Prime Minister of Canada. He just won a close election despite allegations of corruption and an image of him in blackface. Although Trudeau was victorious at the polls, his Liberal Party lost its majority in the House of Commons, forcing the Prime Minister to form a coalition government. At the same time, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu failed to put together enough support in Israel to govern. He's given up on getting majority backing in Parliament. Now his rival, Benny Gantz, will try. He's got 28 days. If he can't form a coalition, there's likely to be elections in Israel. Netanyahu is Israel's longest-serving prime minister. Abortion and same-sex marriage will soon be legal in Northern Ireland. Backers of the anti-church measure celebrated at a bar in Belfast.
So welcome to history of Northern Ireland.
A last-ditch push to get the country's legislature to block the law failed. Today, new rules imposed by the British Parliament took effect. At the start of this year, abortion became legal in Ireland after voters approved. Now, in the north, same-sex marriages are expected to begin by February 2020, and abortions will be permitted 2 months later. The Northern Ireland Bishops' Conference has vigorously condemned the British for forcing the measure on their country. There's a lot more news headed your way, including some wild storms that have the nation on alert. Wind, rain, and fire, all the elements coming together to create chaos from coast to coast. We'll have the latest weather warnings. Religious leaders in Chile are praying for peace as police and protesters clash. Plus, Catholics around the world are remembering the man and saint that brought down communism. Wind, rain, and fire are all causing chaos across the United States. Wild weather is affecting millions of Americans tonight, and the threat isn't over yet. Nadia Romero has that story.
A chopper dousing water over wildfires in California is a normal yet menacing sign of what's to come. A fire scorched 40 acres in Pacific Palisades already this week. 40 homes still threatened in San Bernardino, with windy conditions continuing Tuesday.
The wind shifts and it can start a whole nother fire.
Now it's up to goats to chomp down on the fuel for flames. With Pacific Gas and Electric ready to shut off power to some 209,000 customers this week. Too hot and too dry in California, the opposite of the Midwest. Severe weather brought rain and wind, knocking down trees and power lines in Missouri. The Midwest and Northeast bracing for more of the same in the coming days. In Oklahoma, a family mourns the death of a woman killed in her mobile home during a storm this week.
It's a bad weather, lots of bad wind. I thought I was going to have a couple trees on me, to tell you the truth.
Just next door, Texans continue cleaning up after an EF3 tornado touched down, wreaking havoc.
That's a monster.
Go in the tornado!
But in the midst of chaos,
I was just so focused on the pain from the contractions.
There's also opportunity.
You have to come in the laundry room. There's a tornado.
A new life brings a silver lining in the darkness of the storms. In Washington, Nadia Romero, Currents News.
Outrage continues over in Rome tonight as Indigenous people speak out for the first time since their statues were tossed into the Tiber River. They are calling the incident an act of hate, one that directly disrespects the statue and the people of the Amazon. Melissa Butts has an update for us from the Vatican.
A day after all of the figures of the Indigenous naked pregnant woman were taken from inside a church near the Vatican, the Indigenous are denouncing it as an attack, saying it was committed by people who hate the Indigenous. Amazonia Casa Común, or Amazon Common Home in English, is condemning acts of violence committed against the Indigenous when controversial feminine statues were stolen. The culprits videoed themselves taking Indigenous figures and throwing them in the Tiber River. The coordinator of the exhibition where the statues were taken from, called Amazon Common Home, refused to speak. I can't and I don't have to speak about these things. There are legal proceedings in process and we're maintaining our silence on the issue. The coordinator pointed to a press release issued after the crime which states, "We deeply regret and denounce that in recent days we've been victims of acts of violence which reflect religious intolerance, racism, vexatious attitudes which above all affect Indigenous peoples." The Indigenous now stand outside the church where the act took place, denouncing this attack against Mother Earth. It's an attack on a figure that represents life, represents the Indigenous. She's our Mother Earth, which represents our life. Now I know this attack was also against us because it was done by people from the far right, people who hate Indigenous people. A prime reason Pope Francis called this synod is to combat hatred and injustice against Indigenous populations. Violence against them is seen not only in the Amazon region, but also in the heart of the Eternal City. Despite the attack, the Indigenous told me that they feel happy to be here in the Vatican, participating in the synod. They say that they feel listened to by the only world leader who will lend them an ear, Pope Francis. In Rome, Melissa Butts, Currents News.
The Holy See is condemning a conservative Catholic site after they praised the dumping of the Indigenous statues into the river. One Vatican spokesman saying, "In the name of tradition and doctrine, an effigy of maternity and the sacredness of life was dumped in contempt." The Vatican spokesman went on to call the incident a violent and intolerant gesture. Tonight, the Chilean government is taking action to end unrest that's ravaged the country for days, clamping down with a curfew. They've also rolled back the fare increases that sparked it, but that move may be too late. Matt Rivers reports that the anger in the streets of Chile's capital now goes far beyond high fares.
One of Latin America's largest cities, Santiago, is paralyzed. At least 11 dead so far, hundreds arrested, and millions of dollars in damage since last Friday. Late Sunday night, the country's president, Sebastián Piñera, didn't mince words.
We are at war with a powerful enemy, relentless, that does not respect anyone or anything.
The president's rhetoric could spur further violence and protests that began over a transit fare hike. Violent clashes between police and protesters have gone on for days now, with dramatic effect. Looting has been rampant. Massive buildings and train stations have been set on fire, and for the first time since a military dictatorship ended in 1990, the country's military has been deployed on Santiago's streets. A national emergency has been declared as some politicians call for calm.
We are trying to bring back peace to the people. We've received your message, but in order to carry it out, we need to dialogue in peace.
The president first announced the hike would be suspended on Saturday. It did little, if anything, to calm things down. For protesters, the demonstrations and their frustrations are about so much more than a pricier metro ticket.
They are years of repression. They are years of living in misery. They are years of government-imposed measures at the expense of the people.
Though Chile is Latin America's wealthiest country, it also has one of the highest levels of economic inequality in the world. People are frustrated by what they call a lack of economic reform on a number of topics, including pensions, healthcare, and public education. There's also concern about government overreach, as on Sunday, authorities imposed a curfew. Some 10,000 police and armed soldiers were deployed.
Matt Rivers reporting the latest on the crisis in Chile. In a few weeks, Santiago is set to host the APEC summit. If the violence continues, some countries may decide to skip the meeting, dealing a huge blow to Chile's prestige. As Santiago remains under a state of emergency, the violence still continues. Religious leaders in Chile are condemning the violence and calling for justice and peace. Leaders of the Catholic, Jewish, Muslim, and other faiths getting together in a joint statement calling for the unrest to stop, saying, "As men and women of faith, we believe in God and in His mercy. We are hurt by the dead and the wounded from these dark days of our history." Catholics in Chile are offering daily prayers for an end to the violence. Still to come on Currents News. Gym rats of the world, you've got nothing on Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Cancer isn't slowing the justice down. Plus, celebrating one of the most popular saints and popes of our time. It's the feast day of John Paul II, and one cardinal is remembering how he changed the world. Fighting cancer didn't stop Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg from hitting the gym. The 86-year-old was diagnosed a couple of months ago with a tumor in her pancreas. Doctors prescribed 3 weeks of radiation therapy, but that didn't slow down the justice's exercise routine.
I do push-ups, planks, front and side, lots of weight-bearing exercises.
Ginsburg's workouts have been widely celebrated. Her personal trainer even published a book back in 2017 detailing how to train like RBG. She has survived 4 bouts with cancer and is doing well today. Today marks the feast day of John Paul II. His pontificate was one of the longest in church history, and he rallied the world while traveling more miles as the successor of St. Peter than all previous popes combined. New York's Cardinal Dolan marked the feast this morning looking back at a trip John Paul took when he went home to Poland in 1979 at the height of the Cold War. 2/3 of the Polish people turned out for that mass that wrapped up the papal visit. Cardinal Dolan recalls the memorable moment.
And his last mass with 2 million people there, the crowd began to chant during his homily 3 words. We want God. We want God. 2 million people at the top of their lungs yelling out, we want God. Pope John Paul II was able to revive his beloved Poland, to recover their sense that without God we're nothing.
That trip has now been called the 9 days that changed the world, setting in motion a movement that ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of communism across the European continent. Today, October 22nd, is when John Paul's feast is celebrated because on this day in 1978, he became Pope. The words he spoke then moved people around the globe.
Non abbiate paura. Solo lui ha parole di vita. Sì. Di vita eterna.
The future saint repeated those words often during his papacy. Today, thousands of pilgrims visiting St. Peter's Basilica stop and pray before Pope John Paul II's tomb. That is Currents News. I'm Tamara Lane. Thank you for joining us because we are putting your faith in the news. Hope to see you again next time.